Hello, Siskel, 6th and 7th graders. It's awesome to be here sort of with you. Some of you may have met me before or seen me on one of your field trips down to the aquarium. And we were hoping that you'd be able to come up to the Bronx Zoo and meet with some of our staff there. But of course, the zoo is closed now and you're all at home. So we wanted to still provide you with a really exciting guest speaker opportunity while you're at home. And one of the plus sides of everyone working from home is that now we can have your guest speaker be Sarah Olson, who's actually out in Montana. So she wouldn't have normally been able to speak with you in person, but now she can speak with you virtually, which is really great. And you already read Sarah's bio, so you know a little bit about her, obviously, and came up with some really great questions to ask her. So I will just go ahead and turn it over to Sarah so she can introduce herself a little bit, and we can dive into some of the questions that you all came up with.
Great, thank you for that. And again, my name is Sarah Olson, and I'm based in Bozeman, Montana. I'm a wildlife epidemiologist for the Wildlife Conservation Society Health Program. And I started working with WCS back in 2011. And I work at the intersection of wildlife health and conservation. So where there's a conservation issue that involves wildlife health, that's where I really dig in and I try to understand some of the risk factors and ways we can help the critters through that wildlife health, through that health issue. So I work in a variety of places around the world, and I have a couple focus projects in different regions as well. So some of my particular areas are working on the health of great apes and in Central Africa, which also means I work on bats there. And also I started a project working on white nose syndrome here in Western US and up into Canada that looks at the health of bats that are being threatened by a fungal disease. So those are my two main kind of projects that I help lead right now, and then I also support other projects around the world.
That's great. And I know that the students had some, questions about your career, and you already talked a little bit about what you do in your job, but you want to talk a little bit about like maybe what a average day might be like for you doing some of those different projects?
Yeah, sure. So I do a lot of work on a computer. I pull together lots of different data sets. I connect people. I do statistical analysis. So I work with data sets and try to pull information from that data set so we can translate that into actions and information about what are the risk factors. So on any given day, I wake up and I first make sure I'm checking in with my colleagues, and then I'm working on manuscripts. So these are peer-reviewed manuscripts that we use to communicate with other scientists about the science that we're doing. So I work on those, and then I also work on getting more funding to do the work we do. So applying to and explaining to funders why we need funding to research, bats in Africa or bats in Montana. And I also get to go out in the field, which is one of my favorite activities, to really help collect the data. And I'm just so grateful for those opportunities, because you work, so I work remotely, and it's great to do the science, but there's just something about getting close up with a species that you're studying. Yeah, it's just really special to get those opportunities. And I usually get out in the field 1 to 2 times a year, and the trips to Africa take about a month. So when I'm gone, everything from preparing to being in the field for 3 weeks to getting back is a big chunk of time. So those turns into really like long trips, or more like expeditions, I guess.
Yeah. Great. And they were also curious sort of what drew you to bats, what made you choose to work with bats, and what about them do you find interesting?
I actually came out of grad school, and it wasn't bats were really on my radar. I mean, I love bats, and I was asked to work with a colleague to help her. She was a biologist, and there was this new disease in bats called white nose syndrome. And I had a background in health and understanding kind of the health aspects and risk factors. And so I just started working with her and supporting her. And she was an amazing bat biologist and taught me a lot about bats. And I think it kind of brushed off on me. And at the same time, I was being asked to support our field program that was in the Congo, and they were doing more work on bats because so it was a great ape health program, but it turns out great apes can die from Ebola in the same way that people die from Ebola. And so as a conservation organization, we're both interested in keeping people safe, but also wildlife safe. And so we wanted to better understand how and why Ebola was spilling over. And all the evidence then and now points to bats being a potential reservoir for Ebola. And so we were partnering with experts, virologists actually from the National Institutes of Health. And I got to start joining some of those missions and learning about these hammer-headed bats in particular, and getting a chance on my first mission to hold these bats. And I think I just fell in love with them after that. As soon as you look at them, they just have these like Yoda-like ears and these adorable brown eyes, and the males are just little puppies in your hand, really. I mean, we don't get up close and snuggle with them. We're in protective gear, but they just have this attractive personality, I guess.
Yeah. One of the students was wondering, when you first encountered a bat, were you scared at all?
I have to remember when the first time I saw a bat was, probably as a child. I probably had that initial fear response, and it's probably because I didn't know much about bats at the time, and I've learned so much about them. They're just incredible species, and I know you have some questions about it in a bit, so maybe I'll wait to kind of address those. But I was probably a small child, and admittedly, I think my first reaction was just, it's black, it's small, and you've seen pictures. Sometimes they really highlight the teeth, and most of the times bats just don't have anything to do with you. They're the ones that we do see sometimes in a day-to-day, we do need to be aware, because sometimes bats are sick with rabies and they behave really, really differently, and they come sometimes too close to us, and that's when we need to be careful, and we need to tell our parents and have our parents tell our doctors that maybe we got into contact with a bat. And that's something to keep in mind. Bats also carry rabies, and we know it's a fatal disease if it's not treated and addressed. But if you do know you come into contact with bats, there's a ways and there's treatments so that it's not fatal.
Great. And kind of related, are there sort of tricks? How do you capture bats? Are there problems capturing bats? Is it easy or hard, or what do you do to catch bats?
It depends on the bat. So here in the US, what we do, and in Canada, North American bats, Insectivorous bats, we put up nets. We put them along flyways, so bats will typically fly along streamways. There's lots of insects there, and they have flight patterns, and we can set up a net. And sometimes this involves like putting waders on and standing in the creek to set the nets up and to collect the bats from the net. Other methods are in the fall when we capture bats, is we set the nets up near the caves where the bats are going to go into hibernation. And so there's this activity that's called swarming, where there's just a lot of flying around near the entrance to these hibernation sites, and we can set a net up there. So we look for where there's concentrations or there's movement of bats. And then in the winter, when we're doing some really special research, you don't usually want to disturb bats in the winter. And so we only try to go into a cave maybe once in the winter. But one thing you can do is they're sleeping. And so you can literally pluck the bats. You can just kind of grab the bats off the walls of the caves where they're hibernating. So those are a couple different methods. In Africa, it's a bit challenging because the bats are flying 30 meters high. So that's almost half a football field high in the air. And so we have to use really tall nets. And to get the nets up, it's crazy. We have to use a slingshot. So we get these guys, and they have to pull back. It takes two people to run the slingshot to get the cord up high enough in the trees. And then they kind of use a pulley system. Once they get the cord high up in the tree, use a pulley system to pull the nets up so that they're about 30 meters up in the canopy. So a variety of different tricks.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you just touched on it, so I'll jump around with the questions a little bit. But do you mentioned bats hibernating? Do all bats hibernate? Do some of them migrate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are, I went back and looked this number because it's always going up. When I first started studying bats, they're like, oh, there's 1,300 bats. And then there's more and more. And the last count, there's 1,420 bats, which is huge. There's so much bat diversity out there. And bats use different strategies. They're a globally distributed taxa. So we find bats everywhere except in Antarctica, which is pretty crazy. And we find them as far north as Alaska. And so depending on where the bat lives, it's going to use different strategies. So bats in warm areas, they don't need to hibernate because they have access to food resources throughout the year. But when you think about insects, what happens to insects in the winter? Usually they start going away. So bats either have to move, and there's some bats like the hoary bat that will migrate. And then other bats are just going to take another strategy and they're going to hibernate. So there's quite a few bats that also hibernate in the US as a strategy. So that helps them. They build up lots of fat reserves, and then they hibernate, and that really reduces, the number of calories that they burn. And their heart rate drops really, really low. It's really incredible. They burn very small amounts of energy, and then they're able to survive on that fat until spring. So it's just another way to deal with different environmental conditions, depending on where the bat lives.
Right. That's amazing. And so related to, you were talking about how widespread bats are. Where would you say, what country do you think has the most bats?
This was a good question. I did not know the answer, so I had to go look it up. It turns out, let me just double check. It's down here. I think it was Indonesia with over 200 species of bats is the winner. So yeah, Indonesia, 200 species of bats around.
That is amazing. We can go back to talking a little bit more about kind of your job and the work that you do, and then we'll come back to talking a little bit more about bats generally. One of the students was wondering if this was your dream job since you were little. Did you always want to do this kind of work?
I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I just kept following my heart, and things worked out. I think one of the things is my parents told me education always opens doors, and the more education you have, the more doors that are open to you. And so I just kept kind of following that advice, and I studied. I kind of did as many AP classes as I could when I was in high school, so that when I got to college, I could take a variety of classes. I had a lot of my core kind of classes checked off, and those credits were already taken care of. I tried to get involved with research undergraduate and did work in a microbiology lab, and that got me some more scholarships and exposed me to more opportunities. I went to Peace Corps after college because I wanted to see if I was going to be a teacher or not. I wanted to try that out. So I spent 2 years working in Ghana with high school kids and teaching science and math. And then I came back and, I just had lots of questions, and I was interested, I really interested in this space, the intersection of human health, environmental health, and animal health. And it's kind of a field of study that's now called One Health. It's also been called EcoHealth. So I decided to go to graduate school to look at least two parts of that puzzle, because it was such a new field. It's hard to study, find experts that are in all of those spaces. So my graduate work, I looked at the intersection between human health and kind of a new field of environmental health. Environmental health is sometimes thought of as just like water and air quality and things like that. But here we're really talking about ecology and ecologic health. So I looked at the connection between deforestation and malaria in the Amazon. And we found
Oh,
a
wow.
connection between deforestation and how it changes the mosquito communities. And we get more of the mosquitoes that are better at carrying a more deadly form of malaria. And so I was able to make that connection. And yeah, I kind of, after grad school, I was looking, for the next step in my career. And the Wildlife Conservation Society had a position and the light bulb went off. I was like, great. So I have the human health, I've got the environmental health, and here I get to embed myself in an organization and really learn about the conservation and the wildlife aspects of this area of study. And I just haven't left. It's been a great and very grateful. But yeah, I think education just helped open all those doors.
That's really great. So how many different bat species have you worked with, and is there one that's your favorite?
Okay, that's another good question. So I think in Africa, I'm working with about probably 5 to 10 species. We mostly catch those hammer-headed bats, but then we get a few other species, and we get a few that we're always like, don't know if I can identify this one, and then we have to do some barcoding work to speciate what we're looking at. And then here in the US, we're just wrapping up a study that has included about 13 species. And so those are mostly hibernating species that we're looking at for the fungal disease issue. So all in all, probably around 20 different species. And I have kind of two favorites. I guess in Africa, the hammer-headed bats just obviously win my heart. And in North America, the Townsend's bat are just stupid adorable. They have these ears. I don't know, maybe I can send you some pictures after the call. But they have these ears that poke straight up, and they're kind of like tall triangles. And then when they're hibernating, they curl back like little ram's horns, and they're just really tucked in. So that they're just, they're super adorable critters.
That's great. I can try to pull up a couple photos while we're talking too that we can share in a minute. And one other question that one of the students was wondering is what kinds of conclusions are you able to draw about bats now, and what were some of your motives behind going to Africa? I think you mentioned some of that already, but maybe you can just address that question.
And there's kind of a whole story about why we're studying bats in Africa. So there was a lot of these outbreaks of Ebola in the early 2000s in Republic of Congo, and a lot of science was done, and some of the initial work said fruit bats were the potential reservoirs for this virus. And a lot of people were trying to understand how the disease spills over from bats and what are the risk factors. So why do these spillover events, where do they occur, why do they occur, when they occur, all these questions. And it was just a big black box. So around 2010 and 2011, we started partnering with the National Institutes of Health. And we focused on a species of bats, a fruit bat species, because that's where information was pointing at the time. And we just wanted to start a longitudinal sampling of the species of bats. We focused on the hammer-headed bats because they have this really cool attribute. They're a lekking species, which is a weird word, but it basically means the males come in, and it's kind of a mating arena where they compete for the females. And they do this by making a honking sound. And the females come in, and they kind of figure out which male they want to mate with based on characteristics. I think sound is maybe a factor, but it means that there's a high number of bats that come to this site in the forest. And that's where we put our nets up, because there's a lot of activity. It's right in the middle of all this mating activity, and that's why we can capture the bats. So we're still in the process of understanding what's going on. It's a long-term study, but we get there and we maybe only do 1 or 2 sampling missions. One of my colleagues is writing up kind of a study of some of our initial findings, but we do see that these bats have been exposed to Ebola viruses at very low levels. And we just started doing some tracking studies to understand how these bats move, how they use the forest, and how they may be interacting with villages that are nearby. Are they using fruiting trees nearby? We have some trackers on the bats that show that they can roost near the village. Are they potentially sharing food resources? You know, the kids in the village are always walking around and picking things off the ground. And if that's like a fig that just fell off the tree that a bat might have just eaten, is that a risk factor? So
wow.
we're trying to understand and build the story. And that's what some of the pilot studies are about. The tracking study that some of you may have come across was just like, can we track bats? And the first thing is, can you do something? And then the next step is then, you know, asking a scientific question and what we can learn from it. So that's kind of where we're at. We know that these bats are critically important to the health of the forest. They eat figs, and when they fly, then they share or they spread all of those seeds across the forest. So they're important to kind of deposit these tree seeds and keep the forest healthy. So they're valuable ecologically, but we're just trying to understand the best way to mitigate the risks that these bats may present to people and may present to endangered grade 8 populations.
Wow, yeah. That's great. So let's go ahead, since you're kind of talking about hammerhead bats now. The kids had a bunch of different questions about the hammerhead bats, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about bats in general again too. So you talked already a little bit about the difference between kind of male and female hammerheads and hammerhead bats, and maybe a little bit of, you can talk about the difference between hammerhead bats and other species of bats. And I'm going to pull up, while you're doing that, just a photo of the hammerhead bats, so that
oh yeah,
see
I don't know if we talked about, there's like, maybe back to your question about male and females, if you're showing that picture. And that's, I think, one of the other peculiar things. So one peculiar thing about hammerhead bats is they're a lekking species. I think there's maybe only one. I remember there's 1,400 bats, 1,400 bats. And I know there's hammer-headed bats that are a lekking species, and maybe one other species in Mexico that's a lekking bat. So again, that mating arena concept, that makes them pretty unique. And another thing that makes them unique is this, is the shape of the faces that you're seeing here. So they're dimorphic, which means or sexual dimorphism is when there are distinct differences in the size or appearance between males and females of an animal, in addition to the differences between the sexual organs themselves. And so you can see here the picture on the one side, you see the male, he's got this huge nose, and the female on the other picture there, her nose is much more kind of a profile and streamlined. And that, you know, when we're holding the juveniles, you actually can't, you know, you have to look at the genitalia to tell them apart, but they look identical. So the females basically look like bigger juveniles, whereas the males, as they mature, they actually start to smell. They kind of have a musky smell when the really big ones. The males can be up to 500 grams, and so they're pretty hefty in your hands, and you kind of have to use some different techniques sometimes, whereas the females are around 300 grams. And we think some of that shape of the face that develops there, and some of the inside anatomically, there's some air pouches, and we think it's maybe a bit of a resonating box potentially to help amplify the honking sound that they make. And I can send you a link to the sounds that you can hear. And they make the sounds all night, and they kind of pulse. There's like an early morning pulse or early evening pulse, and there's an early morning pulse as well, where we typically hear them. And camp is right below them, so they keep us up all night too when they're making these noises. It's really loud, and we haven't all done the science. I think it may be related to the creation of sound that they're using.
Wow,
that they're known for.
That's really, really cool. And while I'm in here, I'm just gonna show a couple of the pictures of those Townsend big-eared bats that you were talking about.
Oh, great. Yeah, you found them. And you can see how that ear kind of curls back down and around. Yeah, exactly. Those are the best ones.
So cool. Those are some big ears. I love it. Okay, great. So let me see what some of the questions were about hammerheads. One of the students wanted to know when hammerhead bats were first discovered?
This is another good question. I did have it in my records, but I didn't know it off the top of my head. The first mention I see of it in the scientific record, which is kind of different than being first discovered. So I'm sure people in Africa have been living with this species for a long time, and it's all local knowledge. But Western science first reports of it I found go back to 1861. And there's probably some earlier awareness of that because that was an anatomical study that was done. So somebody had received carcasses and they wrote up an anatomical study of the bats.
Are hammerhead bats blind?
Oh, this is a good question too. So fruit bats, they just started doing some work on fruit bats. So you've got rods and cones, and rods are mostly your night vision, which is kind of grays and whites and things like that. And then there's cones, which give us a little bit of color. Fruit bats have a little bit of both. So they probably, of all the bats, have the best daylight vision, but it's still not ideal. Our cones are probably about 5% among the rods and cones. They represent about 5%. For bats, it's about 0.5%.
Oh, wow.
And they found that not all bats, so you have, I think, blue cones and green cones. I was looking this up yesterday. But anyways, the take home is some bats may be colorblind. So even though they have, some of the fruit bats do see color, but they may be colorblind in the same way that people are colorblind. So that they do have the best daylight vision among bats, and they still have great night vision. But it's not maybe what we see on a day, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's still good for bats.
Right.
And we don't know, they haven't looked at hammerheads specifically. So it's likely because they fall in that family that they have an ability to see some color in daylight.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense if they're eating fruit.
Yeah, they're mostly feeding at night, but they think that a lot of the activity, on that tracking study, we can see the activity picks up just as the sun is setting. So they are flying around right at dusk, and we can see them. So it does make sense that they have a little bit of ability. And exactly, they use smell and they can use sight to identify the fruit.
Great. And maybe we can just think a little bit more about, well, I guess I'll stick with the hammerhead bat for a little bit. You've talked a lot about kind of what bats eat, but we'll come back to that. Are hammerhead bats dangerous at all to humans?
That's a good question. I think it comes to how we behave around bats and what our responsibilities are to behave around bats. We're still learning a lot. Bat by itself is not going to be dangerous. It's not going to swoop in and attack you. It's just when I want to go eat fruit. I mean, it's not really interested in what we have to do. It's more when human activities may be disturbing the bats and altering their behaviors, or if we're planting fruit trees in our gardens, potentially it's attracting the bat away from its natural food resources. And the reason these bats might be dangerous is because we do know they have tested positive for Ebola virus. So we know that there's small genetic fragments of Ebola virus that have been found in these bats. But importantly, we've never isolated the virus from a bat anywhere. Like Ebola is still like a big question mark there. We've seen these genetic fragments, but nobody's been able to culture the virus from a specific bat species. But there's that risk, and we know even though spillovers are rare, they have huge consequences. And so that's why precautionary principle kind of comes into play here. If we don't need to interact with bats and we can minimize contact with bats, it's probably best that we figure out ways to do that. So in that sense, bats can be a risk to human health, but I think there are safe ways and ecological ways that we can do that to keep bats and people separated.
Great. And I think you touched on this, but just to make sure that whichever student was asking about hammerhead bats attacking people, it sounds like you were saying that basically bats try to avoid us, and
yeah, they don't attack us.
Attack wouldn't be a problem. It would just be the disease.
No, it's more the risk of potential virus moving from the bat to the people, and that's just completely inadvertent. Like a bat was maybe eating a piece of fruit and the fruit fell down and a child picked it up potentially. Or people do hunt bats, and there was a couple of hunters that we know from epidemiological studies that were index cases in DRC, and they had consumed bats, and we think that was the source of an Ebola outbreak back in the early 2000s again.
Right. You already talked some about the ecological benefits of hammerhead bats. One of the students was asking kind of conservation related questions in terms of like if we stopped helping hammerhead bats, what might happen, or what might have happened if you hadn't, if people hadn't done work to help the hammerhead bats.
So right now, I mean, hammerhead bats are pretty stable, fortunately, but everybody gets concerned, and I think concern is a good thing. What you do about the concern is another. In some places where bats have been of a concern, one of the reactions historically has been to kill bats. So there are some bats in Mauritius, for example, and they were eating all the fruit, and people were upset they were eating the fruit, and so they tried to cull the bats. And we know this isn't good for bats ecologically. And there have been other examples for bats that carry diseases where we know that culling actually increases disease risk. So we're trying to, right now, I think, they're in a good place, but they're losing a lot of their habitat, and there's deforestation happening nearby. And we have questions whether or not that deforestation is going to impact the bat behavior and maybe increase disease risk and spillover risk in these areas. So right now, I think things are okay, but they are losing habitat, and there may be connections to spillover risk that we need to understand so that we can protect the bats and keep people safe.
Yeah. Okay. I think that was all of the kind of specific questions that the students had about hammerheads. So maybe you can talk.
I see one. Was there the one about the females traveling further? That was a great
question.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed that one. Yeah, that is a good question of why females travel more than males.
So the study I did was kind of the first to start looking at that question. And I think it's because the males spend more of their time going to the mating hangout area. They go back to the lek pretty frequently, whereas the females don't have an interest in it. We only had one female tracked in that study. But yeah, she took off, and she was only visiting the lek maybe once a day or once a month, whereas the males are visiting the lek every day. And it's a really small study, but it gives us maybe a hint that the females are busy just, maybe hanging out with other females, going to their, favorite food spots, maybe helping raise young. So yeah, I think it just opens up more questions, but that's my hypothesis, that the males tend to, be driven more of their movement is driven by needing to mate, and whereas the females, they're not going to be ready to mate. The females typically have 2 birth pulses, so most of the time they're not going to be interested in mating.
Great. So you've already talked some, quite a bit about the disease transfer and viruses. The students had a few more kind of questions about that topic of like, so I'll just go through, they're related. So thinking about why bats are accused of, viruses. Are there certain bats that cause certain viruses? And are bats, and specifically they asked about the horseshoe bat, being affected because of COVID-19 outbreak in terms of being like tested and blamed for the virus and things like that. So maybe you can just kind of talk generally about bats and viruses and some of those.
Yeah, there's so much science going on in this space. I'm probably not going to do it justice, but I can try to give a cursory overview. So yes, people, we're probably carrying a couple viruses, couple cold viruses. Maybe some of you have some cold viruses right now. But bats are the same way. They carry viruses. And there's such a diversity of bats. Again, 1,420 different bat species out there. And different viruses are going to be adapted to different species or different families of bats. And one thing that's really an area of research is that scientists think because bats fly, and when you fly, I mean, imagine running 100 100-meter dash. What happens? You're warm, you're like sweating, your body temperature gets elevated. And so when bats are flying, they're elevating their body temperature. Well, what does our body do when we have a really bad virus? We get fever. And that's something that helps, wipe out the pathogen. Most of our viruses we can clear because we raise our body temperature, and the viruses can't handle that higher body temperature. But the viruses that have evolved in bats, again, these are flying mammals, they've had to figure out how to survive in a mammal that has elevated body temperature whenever they go flying. So there's some peculiar characteristics about viruses that have evolved in bats. When they end up in people, the strategies that our body uses to get rid of them simply don't work, because these viruses are like, oh, I got that, check that off, like I've dealt with higher temperatures already. And bats' immune systems are different too, and there's some other factors. But that's one of the reasons why bat viruses in particular may be causing some of these more serious diseases in people that are emerging in recent years. So coronaviruses, to talk about SARS-CoV-2. So that's the name of the virus that causes COVID-19, the disease that's currently causing, this pandemic that we're in right now, and why we're all, working from home. Coronavirus is a really common virus. It's a big viral family. Whales have coronaviruses. Dogs get coronaviruses. We have coronavirus, like 25% of the cold viruses that we get is caused by so the common cold is caused by a coronavirus. But there's only a couple of coronaviruses, like I think it's 7 total coronaviruses that are known to infect people, including this new one. And so this one, it has 96, it shares, so its genetic code is 96% similar to a virus that was found in a horseshoe bat. And they had to sample thousands and thousands of bats to be able to say, we found a bat that had a virus that's 96% similar. But even that 96% similarity, we know that because these viruses accumulate mutations at about a constant rate, like so many mutations per year, we can say that this virus has had 20 years on that common ancestor with that bat, that 96% similarity bat. So this bat, we don't have the smoking gun. This bat that we've got, this 96 is similar, but this virus has evolved for 20 years, somewhere in between when, this last genetic kind of connection was made. And so, yes, the horseshoe bat is the closest known, but we maybe just haven't sampled enough to find a closer match. I don't know if there's a lot there in those questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me know if you want to go into any more detail.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And obviously, for the Siskel students and Ms. Ryer, if, after this talk, more questions come up, you can send them to me, and I can either try to find an answer for you with Sarah, if you are available, or somewhere else, we can try to keep answering some of your questions if there are more that we haven't covered. So I think the last few questions are kind of about bats generally and some of their feeding habits and their interactions with kind of the environment in terms of threats and benefits. So maybe we'll just talk a little bit about the general bat information first. And the students were interested in kind of like the diversity in what bats eat. So like why some bats eat fruit and others suck blood, and whether any bats eat like small rodents or other bats or anything like that. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about kind of the diversity in the kinds of things that bats eat.
Yeah, talk about bias. I mean, poor bats. One of the first bats I think we learn about, and maybe it's because of Halloween, is we learn about vampire bats. But I just wanted to go look this up the other day, but there are only 3 species of bats that actually feed on blood. So that's like a small portion of all bat species out there. And it just comes down to different strategies. So yeah, we know about vampire bats, but that's just 3 species of bats. Numerous bats in the US are going to be insectivorous bats, which do great things. I mean, they eat mosquitoes, which we don't like because they can also transmit diseases, and they're also just super annoying. But they also eat a lot of agricultural crops or pests. So agricultural pests are these moths and things that come in. They can destroy like a crop of corn, for example, and bats will help glean, and they'll come in and they'll eat these moths. They typically eat more moths than they do mosquitoes, probably. It's like the difference between a high fat snack and just like a small little like sugar snack or something like that. So yeah, they have a big impact on agricultural pests. There's bats that help pollinate. So bats are responsible for pollinating over 300 different plant species.
Wow.
In particular, the US, there's one bat species that helps pollinate the agave. And so that's used and needed to create tequila. Is just one other example of ecosystem service bats provide. And then there's lots of these fruit bats that move the seeds around of the fruit that they're eating. So it's kind of like the hibernation question. Depending on where the bat is, it has kind of evolutionary kind of choices to make. Not necessarily choices, but it has to figure out a strategy to survive where it is. And so these bats have been evolving and living in all corners of the world. And depending on where it is, a strategy that works in one place, like eating fruit, isn't necessarily going to work in North America because, here where I am in Montana, we don't have any fig trees. So the hammerhead bat is not coming home with me. It's not going to do well here in Montana. But the insectivorous bats do great here because that's where the resources are. So it depends what food resources are available and then just what the bat can figure out to do. And yes, there are carnivorous bats. There's just a handful of them. I think, maybe a dozen or so. I didn't get the exact number. But some of these bats will eat small rodents like mice, as well as lizards and small birds, even other bats and fish. They're also called predatory bat. And there's one example that I looked up. It's the big-eared woolly bat, and that's found in South America. So these bats are just kind of, trying to get by. And some bats will do a little bit of everything. They're kind of omnivores. They're trying to figure out what resources are available in the habitat that they use.
That's really cool.
And they're pretty clever. I mean, bats catching fish.
Yeah, that blows my mind. That's really cool. How long do bats live for? I'm sure it varies from species to species, but
species, but top end, we know bats can live for 40 years, which is incredible. There are these graphs. Usually there's this line where the size of the mammal and the age of the species, how old that species can get. And bats are way off the chart. So for a mammal of their size would typically be expected to live, 2 to 3 years. And bats are living for 40 years, which is fascinating. And it tells us maybe we have a lot to learn about how they do that. There's some fascinating research on longevity, and maybe we can learn something from them to help improve. Well, for one thing, like they have really low observations of cancer. Like, how do they do that? Why do they have low rates of cancer? Why don't we see more cancer in bats? Is there something that we can learn from by studying them to better understand our own health?
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think you kind of really already covered a lot about the students' questions about the benefits of bats and, all of the pollination and agricultural pests that you mentioned. And similarly, if we lost bats, we'd obviously lose all of those benefits that they provide in our environment. And so I don't know if there are any other negative impacts on humans or other organisms, populations, if bats went extinct, that you wanted to share. That was something that one of the students asked.
I mean, I think I've covered quite a bit.
Yeah.
There's the pollination services, there's the agricultural pests, the insects that we don't want biting us that they're also out there eating. Their ability to basically be the seed spreaders for tropical plants in the forest. And then they're just amazing critters. Like if you take 2 nickels in your hand, it's about 10 grams, I think. And that's about the size of an insectivorous bat, around 8 grams or so. And they're just flying machines that can live 40 years. I mean, they're
Yes.
just such inspirational animals. And I think they have a lot to teach us beyond just, the things that we can count off and,
Right.
quantify in terms of, what benefits they're providing. They just got, I don't know, and there's just so many of them. I mean, I've only worked with 20 out of 1,420 bats that are out
It's
there.
amazing.
So there's just a lot of space for more work, better understanding of what they do, but also just appreciating for just amazing little flying mammals that they are.
Absolutely. Um, so on that note, what are some of the problems that bats face?
Yeah, so bats, like the bats that we have, love insects. We put a lot of pesticides out that kill insects, and so that's kind of an open question: is what are the impacts of all the pesticides we've been putting out, and are
Sure.
they impacting bats? It's a really challenging question to ask because one of the cool things about bats is they fly, but one of the hard things about bats is they fly. So we don't have really good systems to monitor bats and what exposures they're getting to pesticides. And that's a really important field of research. Habitat degradation is another big issue. Wetlands, I mean, they need to use wetlands. There's lots of insects in wetlands. I mean, I have a wetland over here that they're developing right now to put in kind of a
Mm,
shopping mall area. So loss of wetlands is important. Bats in North America are under threat of white nose syndrome right now, which has caused up to 90% mortality in some species of hibernating bats. This is kind of an introduced pathogen. So we think it arrived in New York in around 2006. It's a fungus that's found in Europe and Asia, and somehow it made its way to our shores, and our bats had never seen this fungus before. And so now many bats are fighting for their lives. And we're seeing a couple species that have been listed in Canada and one species listed here in the United States for Endangered Species Act protections. And there may be more. Some of our work was to kind of understand the risk factors, which bats are going to be more susceptible
mm,
in the West, and that's some research we're writing up now. So there's a mix of threats, and it's all about figuring out how we can share the space we have on Earth with bats and give them their space, and make sure that we're also giving them what they need, that they have the resources, so we don't lose more bats, that we continue to have a growing number of bat species. And the curious thing is they keep discovering more bat species because they're kind of going through the records and they're doing more genetics. We definitely want to keep seeing that number going up. We don't want to start losing the number of species of bats on this Earth.
absolutely. Um, that's really awesome. I think you covered all of the students' really great questions. You all came up with some really cool questions. So yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Siskel students, for all of your great questions. And hopefully this is interesting and you learned a lot about field science and bats and ecology and all of the like amazing interconnections. I think that's one of the things that I love the most about biological and ecological sciences is how connected everything is. You know, how deforestation isn't just about losing trees, it's about mosquitoes that carry malaria, and so it's about human health, and we can't separate ourselves from the environment that we live in. And I think that's really, really cool that's true when we're studying bats too. So thank you so much, Sarah. And yeah, unless you have anything else you want to add for the students, we'll bid everyone farewell.
Yeah, I just want to encourage the students. These are hard, challenging times, but keep up your work. Stay focused on your education as much as you can, and good luck.